Intercepted transmission, TSSAVRIN Compact Administrative Log. Station, Orbital Platform Cathara 11, Tessiverin Inner Ring. Status, Decommissioned Life Support Terminated, all personnel evacuated. Flagged by Compact Internal Security, Case File TK 114407. Note, the following entries were recovered from the platform's auxiliary data core during salvage operations. They span 197 standard days. The woman referenced throughout 1 ELARA VUSSACHENDE, Terran National, age 54, former station infrastructure specialist, was not among the evacuees, nor was the child. Begin transcript. She found the clock on the 197th day. It shouldn't have been running. Nothing on Cathara 11 ran anymore, not the water reclamation, not the pressure regulators, not the strip lighting that had once made the commercial arcade look like a street on a living world. Alara had scavenged the last backup cell 9 days earlier and fed it to the air scrubber bolted above the maintenance closet she turned into a bedroom. The scrubber wheezed and rattled and did its work, trading its last reserves of filtration medium for another few hours of breathable atmosphere. The clock had no power source she could find, but its hands moved. She stood in the doorway of the old customs office, one palm braced against the frame, and watched the second hand sweep. The clock was built into the bulkhead, a Tessiverin design, all crystal gears and a face etched with their 21-hour numerals. She'd walked past it 1,000 times in the years she'd worked here, back when the platform hummed with freighter traffic and docking fees, and the smell of coolant and fried kesek from the food stalls on level 4. She hadn't noticed it was still ticking until now. Maybe the station's noise had drowned it out, and only in the silence of a dead platform could its small heartbeat finally be heard. Behind her, very quietly, a small voice said, "It sounds like breathing." Ilara turned. Vale stood in the corridor in the oversized maintenance coverall Ilara had hemmed 3 times and would need to hem again soon because the child was growing despite the rationed food, despite the thin air, despite everything. Her skin was the pale blue of glacial ice. Her hair, silver white, fine as spider silk, fell across the sharp points of her ears. Her eyes were enormous, the color of weak tea, and they were fixed on the clock with an expression Ilara had learned to read over 6 months of silence and small gestures. Not fear, not wonder. Something between the two. A careful, breath-held attention, as if the clock might stop if she looked away. "It does," Ilara said, "a little." Vale's gaze shifted to her. The child did not smile. She had smiled exactly 4 times in 197 days, and Ilara kept each one filed away in the part of her memory where she stored irreplaceable things, alongside her husband's voice, the weight of Earth gravity, the smell of salt air off the Cornish coast. "Can we keep it?" Vale asked. Ilara looked at the clock. It was built into the wall. It weighed, conservatively, 30 kilos. Its removal would require tools she'd already repurposed, and time she should spend checking the seals on the south airlock, which had begun to groan with a sound like old timber under strain. "Yes," she said. On the 188th day, the compact sent a signal. Ilara caught it on the short-range receiver she'd jury-rigged from a custom scanner and the antenna array of a junked cargo drone. The receiver was ugly solder joints like blisters, wires stripped with her teeth because the wire strippers had broken on day 90, but it worked. The signal was automated, a standard navigational advisory. This one said, "KETHRA 11 status, defunct/hazard class, structural decay, do not approach." She sat in the dark of the operations bay and listened to it cycle 3 times. The receiver's display cast her face in pale green. Her hands were steady. Her hands were always steady. It was the one thing about herself she still trusted without qualification. Vale was asleep in the maintenance closet. Curled under the blanket Ilara had sewn from emergency thermal sheeting and the lining of her own jacket. She'd sacrificed the jacket's insulation on day 42, when the child had shivered through a full sleep cycle, and Alara had lain awake listening to the small body trembling, and decided that cold was a problem she could absorb. The child slept with her knees drawn up, and her fingers laced around the small carved figure Alara had made from a piece of the docking clamp. A bird. Not a tessiverin bird. An earth bird. A swallow. Alara had carved it from memory during a long night when the south airlock was groaning and sleep was impossible. It looked nothing like a swallow, but Vale held it every night, and sometimes, when she was very tired, she pressed it to her cheek and breathed against it as if it were alive. The signal cycled a fourth time: "Do not approach." Alara switched it off. She had a list. She kept it on a scrap of packing film, written in grease pencil because the data pads had died weeks ago. The list had 2 columns. On the left, what they had. On the right, what they needed. The left column was short and getting shorter. The right column was long and getting longer. Between the 2 columns, like a breath held underwater, was the distance the child had to cross to survive. Alara folded the list and put it back in her breast pocket, next to the photograph of her husband. She checked the air scrubber, 12% filtration capacity remaining. She checked the water trap she'd rigged beneath the coolant conduit, 3 liters today, enough for the child and a cup for herself. She checked the seal on the south airlock by pressing her ear to it and listening for the whistle that meant vacuum was winning. No whistle, not yet. She went to the maintenance closet and stood in the doorway watching Vale breathe. The child's face was slack in sleep, the tension gone from her jaw and the muscles around her eyes. Awake, Vale carried herself with a deliberate stillness that Alara recognized as learned behavior, the posture of a creature that had survived by not being noticed. In sleep, the vigilance dropped, and what was left underneath was just a child. Small and soft, and terribly fragile in the thin atmosphere of a station that was trying to die. Alara pulled the edge of the thermal blanket up over the child's shoulder. Vale did not stir. 6 months ago, the slightest touch would have woken her. 6 months ago, the child had slept in corners, back to the wall, facing the door. Progress, Alara thought. It looked like a sleeping child. It sounded like steady breathing. It felt like the most important repair she had ever made. On the 171st day, the child spoke a full sentence for the first time. Not the first word that had come on day 63. A soft, nearly inaudible yes, in response to Alara's question about whether she wanted more of the reconstituted protein paste that tasted like wet chalk. Alara had almost missed it. She'd been holding the paste out on a bent spoon, crouched at the child's level the way she always crouched, slowly, obviously, with no sudden movements, and the word had come so quietly that for a moment she thought it was the air system cycling. Not a name. Vale had given her name on day 40, pressing one finger to her own sternum and whispering it like a secret she wasn't sure she was allowed to share. Alara had repeated it back, carefully, matching the child's inflection, the soft V, the long A, the way the L dissolved into silence, and Vale's ears had twitched. Forward, upward. An involuntary motion that Alara later learned meant surprise, the same motion that happened when the child heard unexpected sounds in the station's hull. No one had said her name back to her before. The fact of that, the simple, terrible fact that a child could live long enough to have a name and never hear another person say it, had followed Alara into her sleep that night and every night since. But on day 171, Alara was underneath the atrium's floor plating, replacing a gasket on the water line with a strip of hull sealant, and the kind of optimism that had no business existing on a dead station. The original gasket had corroded through in the night. She'd woken to the sound of dripping, a slow, rhythmic percussion that didn't match any of the station's usual sounds, and traced it by ear through 3 decks before finding the leak. A hairline split in the junction coupling that was bleeding their water supply into the crawlspace below. 1 drop every 4 seconds, each drop a fraction of the margin between surviving and not. Vale crouched above her, peering down through the gap in the floor plating with those enormous amber eyes, and said, in Tessiverin common that was halting and careful and precise, "You always fix things, even when they don't want to be fixed." Alara's hand stopped moving. She lay on her back in the crawlspace, looking up through the gap at the child's face upside down, the ears drooping slightly in that way they did when Vale was trying to say something she considered important. 12 words. A complete thought, with a subject and an observation and a clause that contained, Alara realized with a tightness in her throat, a theory about the nature of broken things. Some things want to be fixed, Alara said. They just forgot. Vale considered this with the gravity that she brought to all new information, head tilted, ears angled at slightly different positions, processing. Did I forget? Alara reached up through the gap and touched the child's cheek with the back of one knuckle. The skin was cool, dry, impossibly soft, a texture she'd never encountered before. Vale, like touching the surface of still water. "No," she said. "You remembered." The child's lower lip moved. Not a smile, not quite, but the muscles tried, and that was enough. The 160th day brought the Inquisitors. Alara heard them before she saw them, the deep, resonant ping of a docking clamp engaging on the north arm. The sound traveled through the station's hull like a struck bell, unmistakable. She was in the hydroponics bay she'd tried and failed to restart, scraping algae from the walls of a growth tank, because the algae was edible if you didn't think about it too hard, and the sound froze her mid-stroke. No ship had docked at Cathara 11 in 112 days. The last one had been the evacuation transport, the one that had taken everyone except the woman who'd refused to board, because a small alien child was wedged behind a ventilation grate in Section 9, and no one else had heard her breathing. Alara set down the scraper. She walked to the maintenance closet and said, very calmly, "Vale, under the floor." The child looked up from the piece of conduit she'd been arranging into a pattern. She arranged things, constantly, small objects into spirals and radials and geometries that Alara suspected carried meaning in whatever culture the child had been torn from. Broken bolts and stripped wires laid out in concentric rings with a precision that made Alara's throat tight every time she saw it, because it was a child's way of making order from chaos. Her amber eyes widened. "Now," Alara said. Vale moved, quick and silent the way small creatures are when the large ones come. She lifted the floor panel Alara had loosened weeks ago for exactly this purpose, slipped into the crawlspace beneath, and pulled the panel back into place above her. Alara heard nothing from below, not a scrape, not a breath. Alara picked up the heaviest tool. She owned a torque driver with a half-meter handle, and walked toward the north arm. There were 3 of them. Tessiverin, tall, robed in the dark blue of the Doctrinal Authority, the Inquisitors. The Doctrinal Authority governed the disposition of displaced persons, unregistered minors, and their particular specialty, children whose bloodlines had been expunged from the Compact's rolls. Stateless children. Children who, in the authorities' terminology, did not exist. Vale did not exist. The lead Inquisitor was a female, easily 2 meters, her skin the gray-green of old copper. She had no hair. Her eyes were narrow, vertical-pupilled, and they swept the docking corridor with the practiced patience of someone who had done this many times. "Infrastructure specialist Vossagend," she said. "It was not a question. The Compact has record of your refusal to evacuate. We are here to process the anomaly." Alara stood in the corridor with the torque driver held loosely at her side. "There's no anomaly. I stayed behind to secure the station's data core, standard protocol. The data core was wiped remotely 60 days ago. Then I'm behind schedule." The Inquisitor's eyes moved past Alara, down the corridor, toward every place a child might hide. "We have received a thermal signature report from the Navigational Advisory Beacon. 2 distinct signatures on a station designated for 0 occupancy. one consistent with a Terran adult, one consistent with a juvenile tessiveran of unregistered origin. Alara's hands were steady. Your beacon's been malfunctioning for months. I filed a maintenance report before the evacuation case number KT 114391. It reads false positives from junction leaks and coolant vents. I can show you the conduit map if you'd like to walk the route. It's about 4 kilometers. The second Inquisitor male, younger, thinner, moved to the left, flanking. The third stayed at the airlock, standard formation. The lead Inquisitor said, "We will conduct a standard sweep. Cooperation is noted and appreciated. Obstruction is prosecutable." "Sweep what you like," Alara said. "There's nothing here but me and a broken water line." They swept for 4 hours. Alara walked with them through every section except the right ones. She talked about the station's layout, the decay rate of hull plating, the mineral content of condensation, the history of Cathara 11. She talked with the unhurried, competent patience of a woman who had spent 30 years maintaining infrastructure, and understood that most problems were solved not by force, but by knowing exactly where every bolt and seam and pressure point was, and by talking long enough that the people with authority grew bored of you before they grew suspicious. She led them through Section 9. She did not lead them through Section 8, where the maintenance closet was, because she took them through the parallel corridor instead, and mentioned that the Section 8 corridor had been sealed due to a hull breach risk. The lead Inquisitor checked the sealed door. It was sealed. Alara had sealed it that morning from the inside, with the same sealant she used on every failing joint. They found the second thermal signature in the hydroponics bay, a heating element she'd left running beneath a growth tank. Its thermal profile roughly consistent with a small body at the resolution of a navigational beacon sensors. "Your anomaly," Alara said, and showed them the heating element. She showed them the wiring, the capacitor, the algae. She explained the cultivation process in more detail than anyone could possibly want, because detail was a weapon and boredom was a shield. The lead Inquisitor looked at the heating element for a long time. Then she looked at Alara. Her vertical pupils contracted. "The compact's position is that unregistered minors represent a jurisdictional liability. They are remanded to processing facilities for assessment, classification, and placement. This is not cruelty. It is order." "I'm sure it is," Alara said. "If such a minor were located on this station, concealment would constitute a Category 2 offense. The penalty includes revocation of compact residency, forfeiture of pension, and criminal detention." "Noted," Alara said. She held the Inquisitor's gaze and did not blink. The Inquisitor held for 3 seconds. Then she turned to her colleagues. "Log the thermal anomaly as environmental. Reclassify the second signature. Mark the station for follow-up in 90 days. They left. The docking clamp disengaged with a sound like a bone being set. Alara stood in the corridor and listened to the ship's engines fade until there was nothing left but the quiet of a station that was dead except for the 2 lives inside it. She went to Section 8, unsealed the door, lifted the floor panel. Vale was exactly where she'd been, perfectly still, the carved swallow pressed to her chest. "They're gone," Alara said. The child climbed out. She stood in front of Alara with that enormous, careful gaze. "You lied," Vale said. "Not an accusation, an observation." "Yes." "Why?" Alara knelt. Slowly, the way you kneel when you want a child to know you are choosing to be at their level, not falling to it. Because the truth would have taken you somewhere you don't belong. Vale put one hand on Alara's forearm. The child's fingers were thin, cool, and very careful, as if she were testing whether the arm was real. "Where do I belong?" she asked. Alara covered the child's hand with her own. "Here," she said. On the 140th day, the south airlock seal failed for the first time. It happened at what passed for night the hours when Alara dimmed the single strip light to a faint amber glow, so Vale's body could distinguish rest from waking. The station had no day-night cycle of its own. It orbited in a pattern that brought it into shadow for 40 minutes out of every 3 hours, and each shadow meant the solar collector lost power, and the air scrubber slowed, and the temperature dropped 4 degrees. Alara had learned to plan around the shadows the way coastal people plan around tides. She was lying on the floor of the operations bay, running calculations she didn't want to run, when the whistle started. Thin, reedy, the kind of sound you feel in your teeth before you hear it in your ears. The sound of atmosphere bleeding through a compromised gasket into the void on the other side of 4 centimeters of hull plating, 4 centimeters between breathing and not breathing, between a station with 2 living people in it and a station with none. She was on her feet before the second breath. Tools in hand, sealant gun, gasket strips, the manual pump she'd fabricated from a fire suppression cylinder, and a length of hydraulic hose. She moved through the dark corridors by memory, counting steps, turning at the junctions she'd mapped so thoroughly that her body knew the route even when her eyes couldn't see it. She found the leak upper right quadrant of the seal ring, a hairline gap where the gasket had dried and cracked. The gasket material was rated for 5 years. It had been installed 8 years ago. She applied sealant in a smooth, continuous bead, pressed the gasket strip into place, pumped the manual pressure compensator until the whistle died. Pump, hold, each stroke pushing air back into the station, each hold a test of whether the seal would take. 11 minutes. When it was done, she leaned against the airlock door with her forehead pressed to the cold metal and her hands shaking from the adrenaline crash. Her breath came in short, controlled bursts. She pressed her palms flat against the door to stop the shaking and held them there until the tremor passed. She walked back to Section 8. Vale was standing in the corridor outside the maintenance closet, holding the carved swallow, her ears rotated toward the south airlock like antennae tracking a sound. The child was barefoot on the metal floor, the oversized coverall pooling around her ankles. She had heard the whistle, of course she had. Those ears heard everything. "Something broke," Vale said. "Something cracked, I fixed it." The child studied her face with the unblinking focus that Alara had come to understand was not rudeness but thoroughness. "Your hands are shaking." Alara put her hands behind her back. "They're tired." "You should sleep." "I will." "You say that, you don't." Alara looked at the child, this small, blue-skinned, pointed-eared person who had spent the first 40 days of their acquaintance in silence, and was now delivering accurate assessments of Alara's sleep habits with the calm authority of a medical professional. "I'll sleep. After I check the seal one more time. I'll come with you." They walked to the south airlock together, the child's bare feet making no sound on the metal floor. Vale stood beside her, listening with ears that could hear frequencies Alara could not, the ultrasonic whine of stressed metal, the subsonic hum of pressure differentials, the spectrum of sound that a dead station produced when it was slowly coming apart. After a moment the child said, "It's holding." "How do you know?" "I can hear the difference between air that's staying and air that's leaving." They walked back. Alara lay down outside the maintenance closet. She always slept outside, between the child and whatever might come. The floor was hard and cold, and she had given away the padding that might have softened it because the child needed the padding more. Her spine had learned the shape of the floor. She no longer noticed. "Alara," Vale said from inside. "Yes." "The seal will hold." "How do you know?" "Because you fixed it." Alara closed her eyes. She slept. For the first time in weeks, she slept through what passed for the night without waking to check the airlock, because a child had told her it would hold and trust. She was learning, went in both directions. On the 110th day, Alara thought she might fail. The south airlock had begun to whistle again, a new crack, lower on the seal ring, where the metal had been weakened by years of thermal cycling. She'd used the last of the professional-grade sealant on day 120. What she had now was a compound she'd mixed from hull patch adhesive and thermal insulation resin, stirred with the handle of a screwdriver in the bottom of a fire suppression canister. The compound was gray and smelled of burning plastic, and she had no idea whether it would hold. She'd tested it on a pipe joint in the atrium. It held for 3 days before cracking. She needed it to hold for longer than 3 days. She sat in the operations bay after Vale was asleep and did the math she'd been avoiding. She used the grease pencil and the packing film. She wrote the numbers small because the film was running out too. The air scrubber had maybe 40 days of filtration medium left. The filter cartridges were designed for a crew of 12 over 6 months. She'd been running a single unit on the lowest setting, feeding it power from the solar collector on a circuit that was never designed for sustained load. The water trap was reliable, but the coolant conduit was corroding hairline fractures in the pipe wall, visible now as dark lines when she held a light behind it. The algae would stretch to 60 days if she ate less. She was already eating less. She'd been eating less since day 1, cutting her portions in half and then in half again, and she could feel it in the way her hands shook at the end of the day, and the coverall hung looser on her frame, and her vision swam when she stood up too fast. 40 days. She could send a signal. There were freighters that still passed within long-range hail distance. She picked up their transponder echoes on the receiver every few days, faint pulses of civilization moving through the dark. She could say, "There is a woman and a child on this station, and we need someone." And the freighter would report them. And the compact would send the inquisitors again. And the inquisitors would find the child and process her, and Vale would disappear into the system that had already lost her once, a system of numbers and categories and facilities where children were classified and stored and never, in any document Alara had ever read, described as children. She turned off the receiver. She walked to the south airlock. She pressed her ear to the seal and listened. The whistle was there, thin, intermittent, the sound of a gasket that was dying millimeter by millimeter. She pressed a fresh bead of her improvised sealant along the crack and smoothed it with her thumb, feeling the compound warm against her skin as the atmospheric pressure difference pushed against it from the other side. 40 days, she said to the airlock. I need you to hold for 40 days. The airlock didn't answer, but it held. On the 89th day, the freighter came. Not a compact ship. A battered Kethani cargo hauler, running dark, no transponder, sliding into the North Arm dock with a pilot's touch so gentle the clamps barely registered. Alara picked up the docking clamp engagement on her receiver, and for a moment she sat very still, because the last time a clamp had engaged, 3 people in blue robes had walked aboard and tried to take her child. Not her child, the child. She corrected the thought automatically, and the correction felt less true each time. She picked up the torque driver and walked to the North Arm. The airlock opened. A woman stepped through Kethani, tall, tawny-furred, wearing a pilot's harness over a patched jumpsuit. She had the look of someone who had been running a long time and had stopped being afraid of it. "I'm looking for a woman named Voss Aiken," she said. "The old net says she's dead. The new net says she doesn't exist. A dock hand on Trevari Station says she's still here." "Who sent you?" "Nobody sent me. I run supplies to places the compact pretends don't exist. Medical camps, refugee shelters, stations that got left behind. I also move children. The ones the doctrinal authority wants to process. I move them to places where processing means a name and a bed, not a number and a cell." Alara's grip tightened. "I don't have a child." The Kethani's ears flicked amusement. "Ma'am, I can see a carved bird on the floor behind you and a blanket sized for someone a third your height. There's a set of hex bolts arranged in a spiral on that shelf, and no adult I've ever met arranges hex bolts in spirals. I'm not the authority. I'm the opposite of the authority. The opposite of the authority is still someone with a ship who can take her somewhere. Somewhere safe. She's safe here. The Kethani looked at the corridor, at the dead light panels, at the condensation, at the woman standing in front of her 54 years old, 20 pounds lighter than she should be, holding a torque driver like a weapon because it was all she had between the child and the universe. "Ma'am," the Kethani said very quietly, "how long do you have?" Ilara's hands were steady, long enough. The Kethani sat down on a crate just inside the airlock. She did not come further. She did not push. She waited. And the waiting was the most convincing thing she could have done, because it was what Ilara had done on day 7 outside a ventilation grate. After a while she said, "My name is Tessia. I was processed. When I was small, younger than whoever is behind that wall. The authority took me from my mother on a transit platform. They said she had no registered address. They put me in a facility for 11 months. A human woman, a dock inspector on Cathara 6, filed 17 appeals to get me out. 17. They denied everyone. She filed an 18th. She framed it as a maintenance liability, said the facility's power grid was non-compliant with compact safety standards, and the children should be temporarily relocated pending inspection. It worked. By the time the compact realized what she'd done, I was on a freighter to the frontier." Ilara said nothing. That dock inspector's name was Marguerite Akand. Ilara's hand stopped being steady. "She died 4 years ago," Tessia said. "On Cathara 6, in her own bed. I paid for the hospice. I named my ship after her. I came here because the dock hand on Travari said a woman named Vasakand was living on a dead station with a child, and I wanted to know if the name was a coincidence. It isn't, is it?" Ilara put the torque driver down. She pressed both palms flat on the crate and breathed. "She was my mother-in-law. My husband was her son, Gareth. He died on this station pressure failure 4 years before the decommission. When the evacuation came, I stayed because the child was here." Tessia reached into her harness and pulled out a small object, a carved bird, not a swallow, a Kethani crest bird, wide-winged, worn smooth by years of handling. "Marguerite made this for me. She wasn't good at carving either." Ilara looked at the bird. She looked at her own hands, the hands that had carved a swallow for a child in the dark. Marguerite's hands had done the same thing years earlier. The gesture traveled. The pattern held. "I have food," Tessia said. "Medical supplies, air filters. And a destination, a settlement on the frontier called Havon. It's small, quiet, has a school, no compact jurisdiction." "How do I know you're telling the truth?" "Because you know what Marguerite did. And you know the kind of people she made." Ilara went to the maintenance closet. Vale was awake. Of course she was. She sat on the thermal blanket with the swallow in her lap. "She's telling the truth," Vale said. Ilara knelt. "How do you know?" She sat down. "She waited like you did." The 51st day was when Ilara told Vale about Earth. They were sitting in the atrium, the wide circular space that had once been the station's commercial hub. 30 years ago, this room had been full of voices, dock workers on their breaks, freighter crews shopping for provisions, the Tessaverin customs officials in their pressed uniforms, the food vendors shouting prices in 3 languages. The Kesek stall had been here, right where Ilara was sitting now. She could almost smell it, the sharp, sweet heat of the batter crisping in oil. Gareth had loved the Kesek. He'd eaten it every shift, standing right here with grease on his chin and a grin that made him look 10 years younger than his age. The light panels were dark now, but Ilara had positioned the solar collector's output to shine through the skylight, and it cast a square of real starlight on the floor, cold and clean. She'd moved 2 crates into the light and covered them with thermal sheeting. It wasn't a table, but it was where they ate, and the starlight made the algae paste look almost like food. Vale was eating without complaint. It broke Alara's heart every time because a child should complain about bad food. A child should push the plate away and say it tastes wrong and demand something better. A child should have opinions and preferences, and the certainty that those opinions matter. Vale ate what was given and said nothing, because saying nothing was how you survived when the alternative was a ventilation grate. Every quiet, uncomplaining mouthful was a record of what had been done to this child before Alara found her. "There's a place where I grew up," Alara said. She hadn't planned to talk about it. The words came the way water comes through a crack, not because you want it to, but because the pressure builds until it finds a way. "A planet. We call it Earth. It has water, more water than land, and the water moves twice a day because the moon pulls it. We call them tides." Vale stopped eating. Her ears tilted forward, the curiosity position, the one Alara had catalogued alongside 20 other positions in the atlas of the child's body language she was compiling, day by day, because no manual existed for this, and she was writing her own. "Why does the moon pull the water?" "Because it's close enough to want to." Vale considered this with the absolute seriousness she brought to every new piece of information. "Do you miss it?" Alara thought about Cornwall, the stone walls running along the cliff paths, gray and green with lichen, the wind that came off the Atlantic with the smell of salt and distance, the sound of the sea at night, filling the bedroom of the house where she'd grown up, a sound so constant that she didn't hear it until she left, and then she heard its absence every night for 30 years. She thought about the morning she'd left, 19 years old, a shuttle ticket to the Orbital Academy and her mother's hand on her shoulder, and the words her mother said, "Fix things, Alara. That's what you're for." "I miss parts of it," she said. "The way it smelled after rain, the weight of the air, the way you could stand at the top of a cliff and see the curve of the world." Vale's hand found hers. The child's fingers wrapped around Alara's palm with a precision that was becoming familiar, always the same 3 fingers first, then the thumb, then the smallest finger last, as if she were testing the grip in stages before committing. "Will you take me there?" Alara closed her fingers around the child's. "Someday," she said. It was the first promise she made on the station that she wasn't sure she could keep. She made it anyway, because some promises are kept not by fulfilling them but by refusing to stop trying. On the 37th day, the power went out for good. The backup cells were drained. The solar collector was producing just enough to run the air scrubber, and even that was marginal on every second rotation. When the station passed into shadow, the scrubber's fan slowed and the air thickened, and Alara could feel the CO2 building at the back of her throat. When the overhead lights died, all of them, the station went truly dark for the first time since its construction. Absolute dark, the kind that presses against your eyes. Alara was in the corridor outside the maintenance closet. Vale was inside. The dark came like a wave, and in 3 seconds of silence, Alara could hear the precise sound of a child's breathing accelerating. She moved, in the dark, by memory, by the map of this station written in her muscles from 30 years. 3 steps, turn left, 2 steps. The doorframe under her palm, down to 1 knee, forward. Her hand found the child's shoulder. "I'm here," she said. Vale's breathing was fast, not panicked. This was the breathing of a child who had been in the dark before, in a worse dark, the ventilation grate where she'd hidden for 2 days before Alara heard her. A dark that meant, you are alone and no one is coming. "I'm right here." She pulled the child close. Vale's forehead pressed against her collarbone. The child's fingers found the collar of Alara's coverall and gripped. "I'm going to fix the light, but I'm going to stay here first, as long as you need." "How long?" Vale whispered. "As long as it takes." They sat in the dark. Alara held the child. She listened to the breathing slow, each exhale a fraction longer, the body's gradual acknowledgement that the dark had not brought the worst thing. The dark had brought a hand on a shoulder and a voice that said, "I'm here." Vale's grip loosened until her hand lay flat against Alara's chest. "Your heart is loud," Vale said. "It's working hard." "Why?" "Because it has a lot to carry." Vale pressed her ear to Alara's chest. After a moment she said, "It sounds like the clock." Alara smiled in the dark where no one could see it. She fixed the light. 2 hours. She rewired the solar collector's output through the scrubber's tertiary circuit, cannibalizing wire from a defunct communications panel. She coaxed a single strip light back to life above the maintenance closet, thin, bluish-white, barely enough to read by, but enough to push the dark back. Vale sat in the glow and looked up at it. Her face had an expression Alara had never seen before. Not hope, something quieter, recognition, as if the light was something she'd lost and found again. "You always fix things," Vale said. "Yes," Alara said, "I do." The 19th day was when the child laughed. Alara had found a set of hex bolts in a maintenance locker on level 3, 12 of them, still sealed in their original packaging. Standard 14 hex head fasteners, carbon steel with a zinc coating, the kind she'd installed by the 1,000 during Cathara 11 last refit. They had no practical use now. Everything she needed to fasten was being held together with sealant and hope. But she'd opened the package anyway because her hands needed something to do, and sorting small objects by size was the closest thing to peace she'd found on the station. Vale appeared beside her. The child moved like that without sound, without announcement, materializing at Alara's elbow as if she'd always been there. She watched. The child watched everything Alara did with the intensity of someone compiling a manual, cross-referencing every gesture against some internal library of human behavior that she was building from scratch. Alara stacked 3 bolts on top of each other, threading the hex faces together so they balanced. She added a 4th. They balanced. She added a 5th, and the whole stack toppled with a tinny clatter that rang off the metal walls and faded into silence. Vale looked at the scattered bolts. She looked at Alara, and she made a sound. It was small, barely a sound at all, a huff of air through the nose, a vibration in the chest that Alara felt more than heard. But it was a laugh, the first one in 19 days on this station, and possibly the first one in months or years before that, the first one in however long this child had been surviving in ventilation grates and cargo holds, and the spaces between systems that had no room for her. Alara's chest did something complicated. She kept her face neutral. She stacked the bolts again. Carefully, deliberately, with the exaggerated concentration of someone who was absolutely trying their hardest. They toppled. The sound came again, louder this time, and Vale's ears tilted forward and her shoulders shook with a motion that was clumsy and unpracticed and absolutely unmistakable. The child's hand came up to cover her mouth, an automatic gesture, a reflex from a time when making sound was dangerous. Alara reached over, very gently, and moved the child's hand away from her mouth. "That's a good sound," she said. "Don't hide it." Vale's eyes went wide. Something shifted behind them, a recalibration, a rule being rewritten. Sound is dangerous became sound is allowed, and the rewriting showed on her face like a light turning on in a room that had been dark for a long time. Alara kept stacking, kept toppling, kept pretending she was trying to balance them when she was really just trying to hear that sound one more time, because it was the sound of something restarting a system coming back online, a light pushing through the dark, a child remembering that the world could be funny and she was allowed to notice. The sound came 3 more times before Vale grew quiet again, but it had been there, in the air, in the room, in the space between a woman and a child on a dead station at the edge of nothing. It hung there like the last note of a song, and the silence after it was a different kind of silence, warmer, less empty, as if the room itself had been changed by the sound and would not go back to what it was before. Alara collected the bolts and put them in her pocket. She would carry them for the rest of her life, not the bolts, the sound. On the seventh day, Ilara found the child. She had known about her for longer, the docking authorities' records, which she'd memorized in the first hours after the evacuation, listed an unregistered juvenile detected in Section 9, flagged for doctrinal authority processing. The records were clinical, precise, and completely inadequate. They said the child had been discovered in the cargo hold of a refugee transport from the Outer Rim, a hold designed for bulk grain storage, not people. The transport was decommissioned. The refugees processed, assessed, classified, dispersed to resettlement facilities across 3 systems. The child had been missed. Missed, as if a living being could be a rounding error. As if a child could fall through the cracks in a system specifically designed to account for every person, and the system's response was not alarm but a notation in a log. The evacuation came fast. Pressure anomalies across the eastern quadrant, the same section where Gareth had died, the same joints she'd been warning the administration about for 2 years, filing reports that were acknowledged and archived and never acted upon. The compact ordered full withdrawal. The transports loaded in 12 hours. Ilara was on the manifest. Slot 47, Window B, with her duffel and her pension and her 30 years of service in a folder, the administrative office had printed for her as a courtesy. She didn't board. She went to Section 9. She searched the cargo bays, the service corridors, the maintenance shafts, the ventilation system. 7 days of methodical, patient searching grid by grid, crawlspace by crawlspace, with the absolute conviction that the answer was in the structure if you knew how to read it. She read it. She read every duct and hatch and access panel the way she had read infrastructure for 30 years, listening for the sounds that didn't belong, looking for the signs of presence that a frightened child couldn't fully erase. She found the child in a ventilation grate on the 3rd sublevel. Vale was wedged into the duct, knees to chest, making no sound. Her skin was pale blue, paler than it would become, thin and drawn tight over bones that were too visible. Her coverall was torn at both elbows and stained with something dark that might have been cargo residue or might have been blood. Her eyes were open, and they looked at nothing. The 1,000-meter stare of a creature that had reached the bottom of its reserves and was waiting for whatever came next without the energy to care what it was. Ilara knelt at the grate. She didn't reach in. She didn't speak loudly. She didn't move quickly. She crouched at the child's level and said very quietly, "My name is Ilara. I'm not going to take you anywhere you don't want to go. I'm going to sit here until you're ready." The child looked at nothing. Ilara sat. She sat for 4 hours. She sat while the last transport loaded and sealed and detached with a shudder that ran through the station like a sigh. She sat while the station's primary power grid shut down section by section, the lights going out like a city falling asleep. She sat while the artificial gravity flickered and the air took on the thin, metallic taste of reserves. She sat while her career ended, while her pension lapsed, while every safe path sealed behind her like airlock doors closing. She sat on the floor of a dying station and waited for a child she didn't know to decide that she was worth trusting. She kept her hands visible and her breathing even and her voice, when she spoke, low and steady and absolutely without urgency, because she understood with the clarity of someone who had spent her life reading systems that this child had been failed by every system she'd ever been inside, and the only thing Ilara could offer that was different was time. In the 4th hour the child moved, one hand. It came out of the dark of the ventilation duct and rested on the edge of the grate, fingers curled, palm up. Open. Ilara took it. The hand was cold, it was small. It trembled with a fine, continuous vibration that she could feel all the way through her own bones, and into the place behind her ribs where her heart was doing something it hadn't done in years, breaking, and holding and breaking and holding again. "There you are," Ilara said. On the first day, before the child, before the dark, Before the clock and the inquisitors and the laughing and the promise and the freighter captain who came because a name traveled further than anyone expected, Ilara Vasakand had a choice. The evacuation transport was loaded. 57 personnel, 9 contractor families, the administrative staff who had run the station's docking authority, the vendors who had sold Kesek and Tesseverin liquor and repair parts in the commercial arcade. All of them funneling through the North Arm, carrying what they could, leaving everything else. The transport was a compact-class personnel carrier, built for efficiency, not comfort rows of acceleration couches and overhead bins, and the particular smell of recycled air and anxiety. Her bag was packed, one duffel, 30 years compressed into 12 kilos, the coverall she wore, the photograph of Gareth over her heart, because that was where it weighed the least and the most, the multi-tool he'd given her on their 5th anniversary, the one with the inscription worn smooth by use, for the woman who fixes everything. She'd fixed everything on this station except the joint that killed him. The docking arm was sealed, the boarding ramp was closing, and the docking authorities logged the same log she'd checked every morning for 30 years, the log that tracked arrivals, departures, cargo weights, personnel movements said, unregistered juvenile /section 9/flagged for processing /status, not located. Not located. 2 words, the smallest possible acknowledgement that a child existed and had been lost. Not lost. Left. Left behind in the rush of an evacuation that had time for cargo manifests and pension transfer paperwork and the careful cataloging of station assets by serial number, but not for one small person who had no registration number and therefore, in the compact's arithmetic, did not count. Ilara had seen the log entry 3 hours ago. She'd shown it to the evacuation coordinator, a young Tesseverin male who had looked at the entry and looked at the timeline and said, with genuine regret, "We don't have the personnel to search. The compact will send a follow-up team." The follow-up team would be the inquisitors. Ilara knew what happened to unregistered children when the inquisitors found them. She had read the policy documents. She had seen the facilities on Kethara 6, where Marguerite had fought for 11 months to extract a single Kethani child. She looked at the boarding ramp. She looked at the corridor behind her, the one that led to Section 9, to the dark and the cold and the silence, and a child who had been flagged for processing, because she existed in the wrong category. She stepped off the ramp. The transport sealed behind her. The docking clamp disengaged with the heavy, final sound of an airlock that would not open again. The station shuddered once, the way an animal shudders when the warmth leaves it, and then it was quiet. The kind of quiet that has weight. The kind of quiet that settles into walls and floors and makes the whole structure feel like a held breath. Ilara Vasakand, 54 years old, widowed, pension lapsed as of this moment, career ended as of this moment, every connection to her former life severed as cleanly as a docking clamp, walked toward Section 9. She didn't know the child's name. She didn't know her species, her language, her history. She didn't know how long the air would last or whether anyone would come. She didn't know that she would spend 197 days on the station, or that she would hold it together with sealant and stripped wire, and the sheer, grinding refusal to let a single system fail while a child depended on it. She knew one thing, it was enough. A child was in the dark, and Ilara was the only one who stayed. Addendum Compact Administrative Log, Cont. The following is appended to Case File TK 114407 by order of Doctrinal Authority Regional Command. On day 201, the cargo hauler Marguerite, registration unrecorded, was detected departing the Kethara system on a frontier trajectory. No manifest was filed. The vessel did not respond to hails. Pursuit was considered and declined on grounds of jurisdictional priority allocation. On day 214, a maintenance drone deployed to Kethara 11 for structural assessment recorded the following. The station's auxiliary systems had been extensively modified. Water reclamation lines had been rerouted through coolant conduits. A solar collector had been rewired through the communications array. An air scrubber had been rebuilt using components from at least 6 unrelated systems. A single clock in the customs office had been removed from the bulkhead and set on the floor of a maintenance closet, surrounded by a nest of thermal sheeting and the carved remains of what appeared to be a small wooden bird. The drone also noted that the south airlock seal, which should have failed catastrophically within 60 days of the evacuation based on the station's decay projections, had been repaired no fewer than 11 times using a non-standard sealant compound. The compound's composition was later analyzed and found to consist of hull patch adhesive, thermal insulation resin, and traces of human epithelial cells. The filing clerk who processed this report wrote in the margin, "She held it together with her bare hands." On day 580, a junior clerk in the Doctrinal Authority's Archival Division, reviewing case file TK 114407 for periodic closure, noted a discrepancy. The thermal anomaly logged as environmental on day 160 had been flagged by the station's own automated systems as biological. The clerk filed a request for reclassification. The request was denied. The denying official's name was Inquisitor Seval, the same officer who had conducted the day 160 sweep, who had stood in a corridor and looked at a woman holding a torque driver and decided to log a child as a malfunctioning heating element. Her annotation read, "Classification stands. Environmental. No further action." On day 1847, roughly 5 standard years after the evacuation of Cathara 11, a filing was recorded in the Civil Registry of Havon Settlement, a small frontier community outside compact jurisdiction. The filing was a legal name change, executed under Havon's local statutes, which required only a witness and a willing clerk. The previous name on the filing was Vael, no surname, no registered origin, no bloodline, no category, no classification. A name and nothing else. The new name was Vael, VSSACHNDA. The witness signature on the filing belonged to a woman named Tessia, who listed her occupation as freight operator and her vessel as the Marguerite. The officiating clerk's notes read in their entirety, "Mother present, child present, both in good health." The child held a small carved bird throughout the proceeding. The mother held the child's hand. No objections were filed. On the 197th day, the clock kept ticking. Ilara stood in the doorway of the customs office and watched it sweep. Beside her, a small hand found hers. Cool, dry, precise. The child's grip was not desperate. It was not needy. It was the grip of someone who had learned in 197 days that the hand would be there, that it would not be withdrawn. "Can we keep it?" Vale asked. Ilara looked at the clock. She looked at the child. She thought about Tessia, the ship, Havon, the school. She thought about Cornwall and tides and the sound of the sea. She thought about Gareth's photograph and Marguerite's carved bird. She thought about the swallow that looked nothing like a swallow but was held every night by a child who had chosen, in a ventilation grate on a dying station, to put her hand out and trust a stranger. She thought about the first day, the boarding ramp closing, the corridor stretching out before her. The choice that was not really a choice, because a child was in the dark, and Ilara was the kind of woman who stayed. "We'll take it with us," she said. The clock ticked. The child held her hand. And in the thin, cold light of a dead station at the edge of the Tesseverin inner ring, where nothing was supposed to live and nothing was supposed to matter, a woman and a child breathed together, and the sound was like a clock that had no reason to keep running but did anyway, because someone had decided that it should. End of transcript. Archival note. Case file TK 114407 was permanently closed on day 2190 by order of the Doctrinal Authority's new regional director, whose name is not recorded in the public filing. The file's final status reads, "Resolved, no anomaly found." The clock, as of last report, still runs.